the end of the French and Indian War. Whether it was the severe national financial problems after the war, or the negligence in managing the colonies, or the growing rebellious sentiment taking root. In short, many British politicians realized that the British North American colonies needed reform to meet the empire's requirements. Under this prevailing view in British politics, in 1763, the newly appointed British Prime Minister George Grenville initiated a reorganization of the loosely organized colonies. First, targeting the vast lands left behind by the departing French, Grenville's government issued the 1763 proclamation, prohibiting colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. To expand westward, the British plan was to control western expansion, to largely avoid clashes with Native Americans, thereby saving unnecessary military expenses. More importantly, it would slow the migration of people from the coastal areas to the interior, and also reserve more land for opportunities in speculation and the fur trade for the British. However, the British government's attempt to restrict the westward expansion of American colonists proved ineffective. The rebellious colonists continued to push westward. After the successful implementation of the 1763 proclamation, the British began to tighten their control over the colonies more directly. In 1764, the British enacted the Sugar Act, imposing heavy duties on sugar imported from non-British sources, and granted British merchants a de facto monopoly in the American market. Furthermore, to prevent smuggling, the British government also established new admiralty courts with juries not appointed by local residents to try cases. That year's Currency Act was designed to protect the rights of British creditors. The British government also revoked the colony's right to issue currency, which severely struck the colonial economies already lacking sufficient hard currency for daily life and trade. In 1765, the British government enacted the Stamp Act, beginning to levy taxes on most printed materials in the colonies. After that, newspapers, contracts, licenses, and even wills were taxed. Although the economic burden imposed by this tax was not heavy, it set a precedent. Unlike the Americans, who saw taxation as a business tool to regulate trade, the Stamp Act was perceived by the colonists as an unauthorized tax imposed by the British government without the consent of the colonial assemblies. They believed that if they did not resist this new law, then even heavier taxes would inevitably follow in the future. So, in the same year the Stamp Act was enacted, representatives from 9 colonies convened a meeting in New York. After the meeting, it was resolved to petition the King and Parliament. While acknowledging that American colonists were subordinate to Britain, they denied the legitimacy of British taxation on the colonies, unless it was agreed upon by the local colonial assemblies. Meanwhile, some citizens in colonial cities also became aware of the new law. In protest, riots erupted one after another. The largest riots occurred in Boston, where an organization called the Sons of Liberty not only intimidated tax collectors and colonists who did not boycott British goods, but also attacked the residences of pro-British officials. However, neither the colonial assembly's petitions nor the popular riots directly led to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Its repeal ultimately came about due to the colonial boycott of British goods. The British feared losing the American market, which raised concerns about the economy. In 1766, the incumbent British Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, convinced the King to repeal the Stamp Act. However, this move was seen by the British landed aristocracy as a concession made to the colonies. They feared, and thus put pressure on the King, forced the Roguram government to dissolve, and reinstated the British Prime Minister. The elderly William Pitt, due to health and other issues, caused a real political power in Britain at the time to fall into the hands of a politician who was both intelligent and extremely reckless, but also a very reckless politician. He was the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. Almost every policy he implemented in America ended in disaster. In 1767, the British Parliament passed 2 resolutions. The first was to dissolve the New York Assembly, to force the colony to accept the Riot Act passed in 1765. The Riot Act required the colonies to provide housing and supplies for British troops stationed in America. This demand was seen by the British as entirely reasonable, intended to protect the settlers. But the colonists saw it as an infringement on their freedom and rights. In reality, the colonists did not oppose providing housing and supplies for the army. In fact, since the French and Indian War, they had been willing to do so. Their opposition was because what was once voluntary was now being enforced by order. After the Massachusetts Assembly rejected this mandatory law, the New York Assembly took similar action. Consequently, New York's refusal undoubtedly posed a greater challenge to the authority of the British government, because the British military headquarters in America was located in New York. Besides the Riot Act, to increase taxes on the colonies, Townshend implemented a series of tax measures known as the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts imposed duties on various goods imported to the colonies from Britain, such as paint, paper, felt, tea, and other goods. These measures were never agreed upon by the colonies. This series of taxes ignited even greater anger among the colonial people, To express their dissatisfaction with the mother country, North American colonists shouted, "No taxation without representation." In 1770, amid tense atmosphere, British soldiers clashed with North American colonists, leading to the famous Boston Massacre, resulting in 5 civilian deaths and 6 injuries. After the Boston incident, colonial dissatisfaction continued to grow. Given the increasingly severe situation in the North American colonies, the British government later made concessions, repealed most of the taxes, only retaining the tax measures, to assert its status as the mother country and its right to tax. The tariffs imposed by Britain at the time were actually not heavy, only 3 pence per item. But the British politicians who considered themselves clever did not anticipate that this seemingly trivial 3 pence would become the last nail in the coffin of the British Empire. In 1773, to help the British East India Company deal with surplus tea, the British government began subsidizing tea sold to North America. As a result, North American tea merchants suffered huge losses. These tea merchants accused Britain of undermining fair trade. They stirred up the already strong rebellious sentiment in the colonies. Combined with the tea tax, the familiar slogan, "No taxation without representation," was heard again. In December of the same year, to express their discontent toward the mother country, a group of young men disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded 3 merchant ships recently arrived from British India. On the ships, they dumped over 300 chests of tea into the sea. After the Boston Massacre, facing escalating riots in the colonies, the British government lost patience and decided to severely suppress these rioters. In 1774, in Massachusetts, where the conflict was fiercest, Britain implemented coercive acts, stripping Massachusetts of most of its autonomy. And Britain originally thought this method of killing the chicken to warn the monkey can set an example in the colonies. But the result was the opposite of what was intended. The coercive acts did not isolate Massachusetts. Instead, they turned it into a hero in the eyes of people across the colonies. The imposition of the coercive acts intensified colonial resistance. More and more colonists started to question the British Parliament's authority over the colonies. These North American colonists braved hardships, crossing the ocean to reach the New World. Wasn't it to escape the harsh conditions in Britain? It was clearly British oppression and neglect that forced them to North America. It was through their own hard work that they earned the prosperity of the colonies today. What right did the British have to take away their wealth? And their rightful rights here? Those were rights that American colonists fought to defend their freedom. For many Britons at that time, this might have seemed new, but in America, it was not a new freedom, but something they had possessed since setting foot on this land. It was the tradition they most longed to protect and were most familiar with. Furthermore, for a government that should derive power from the people, but refused to listen to their opinions, and instead tried to force submission through intimidation and threats. In fact, for the people, beyond worrying about the present situation and fearing what the future might bring, they should be even more vigilant. In the face of the mother country gradually infringing on colonial rights, the North American colonists no longer intended to endure silently. The coercive acts were enforced. In the same year, under the call of Massachusetts and Virginia, 56 delegates from 12 North American colonies, excluding Georgia, gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for the First Continental Congress. Among these 56 delegates, many were well-known names, such as Massachusetts Delegate Samuel Adams, Seth, John Adams, and Virginia Delegate George Washington. John Adams was the driving spirit of this Congress. 3 important resolutions, which explain the reasons for colonial resistance, the difficulties of the colonies, and a declaration of the rights colonists should have. To express their dissatisfaction, they decided to stop buying British goods, the Continental Association, and called for the repeal of the coercive acts, while reaffirming loyalty to the king. Additionally, the Congress established a militia and a committee of correspondence to ensure all patriots could keep abreast of official developments. The Congress also decided to meet again in May 1775 to follow up on Britain's response. But before Parliament could react, the Continental Congress decisions caused a stir in the colonies. At that time, although many North American colonists hated the British government, they still held some hope for it, hoping to remain loyal. The Congress resolutions made some colonists feel their freedom, and rights were being violated. At least, they believed they had the right to decide how to trade. Afterwards, these people were targeted in retaliations led by mobs and thugs claiming to defend freedom and democracy. When this unrest spread to Britain, the British bourgeoisie cried out in despair, demanding the government take immediate action to bring the mobs back in line. But after hearing Britain's response back in North America, the revolutionary leaders realized the seriousness of the situation. To guard against retaliation from the mother country, they purchased large amounts of gunpowder and firearms and hid these weapons. However, soon, these suspected signs of unrest were detected by the British. So British troops launched operations to raid arsenals and secretly arrest offenders. in an age full of spies. All messages seem interconnected, of course. Some information is often overinterpreted, as it's passed along by word of mouth, but the British secret operations were eventually uncovered by the revolutionary forces. Some even believe that the war had already begun. April 1775. In Lexington and Concord, British troops on a clearance mission encountered the revolutionary forces. A tense standoff ensued. Eventually, both sides exchanged fire, although it is impossible to verify who fired the first shot. It doesn't matter, as the shots had already echoed across North America, but the sound of gunfire had already resounded throughout North America. The air thunder was seen by both sides as a mutual response. The relationship between the colonies and Great Britain had reached an irreconcilable deadlock. May 1775. The Second Continental Congress convened, with all 13 states, having all their colonial representatives present, facing an urgent situation, which led them to set aside past suspicions and hostilities, at a time when the situation was spiraling into chaos. In such an environment, a united spirit was already prepared to face the worst possible outcomes.